In this lecture, we will look at three other types of punctuation marks: the dash, the hyphen, and the slash. First, let's look at the dash. The M dash is the most common type of dash. Now, some people consider the M dash as an informal punctuation mark, but I disagree. I think dashes can serve many purposes, especially in formal or technical writing. We form the M dash by typing two hyphens in Microsoft Word or any word processor with no space before or after the mark. Normally, Microsoft Word will automatically convert those two hyphens into an M dash if it detects that there's no space following the dash. And the reason that this dash is called an M dash is that it's the length of the capital letter M. So if you want Word to automatically insert the M dash, then just type two hyphens and then start typing your next word, and Word will automatically convert that. Alternatively, you can insert an M dash by using the insert symbol or by typing Control plus Alt plus minus sign on the keypad. Now that we've established how to create an M dash, let's look at when we would use an M dash in writing. We would use an M dash to add material such as illustrations, examples, or summaries to the end of sentences or to emphasize a shift in tone or thought. For example, at the podium, Coach Bull claimed that he was at a loss for words. M dash. And then he proved it for more than an hour. Here we have an example or a shift in tone or thought that's offset by an M dash. Also, we use an M dash to insert information to a sentence. For example, if we want to use a dash to emphasize material, unlike using parentheses, which de-emphasizes the material. For example, New York, Los Angeles, and Denver, but not Phoenix, are all acceptable convention sites. In this example, we want to call attention to the fact that Phoenix is not an acceptable convention site, so we put that in between a pair of M dashes. If we had put it in parentheses, then we're de-emphasizing it. We're not calling attention to it. It's an extra information. It's not important. But in this sentence, it is important that we want to make note of the fact that the writer does not consider Phoenix an acceptable convention site. So instead of using parentheses, we use a pair of M dashes. Finally, we can use a pair of M dashes to set off a parenthetical element that contains commas. For example, four tragedies, M dash, Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, and Othello, M dash, are generally considered Shakespeare's best plays. Two final points that I want to make about the use of the M dash. The first is that the M dash can be used to indicate an abrupt change in thought or an interruption. For example, a quotation from William Faulkner's short story, A Rose for Emily. "I want some poison," she said. "Yes, Miss Emily. What kind? For rats and such? I'd recca M dash. I want the best you have. I don't care what kind." In this sentence, the M dash is used to indicate an interruption. In other words, the person that is responding to Miss Emily is probably a store clerk, and he or she is saying, "I recommend," but when he gets to "I recommend," Emily interrupts him and says, I want the best you have. So we use an M dash here to indicate in dialogue that there's an interruption. Also, by the way, just happen to note that the actual source citation, William Faulkner Rose for Emily, also is offset by an M dash. Another example of using an M dash is to indicate the omission of letters. For example, in the movie Scarface, Tony Montana says the word FM-K 182 times. Now, that is a true statistic, by the way. He does say the F word 182 times in the movie, but also note that the M dash is used to indicate that some words are omitted, or some letters are omitted, so we don't have obscenity here, but of course most everyone's going to know what that means. Also note that since the words be treated as an object, as we discussed in the lecture on italics, the F and the M dash and the K are also italicized to indicate that we're not using the symbolic meaning of the word, but rather we're treating the word as an object that we're discussing. The next type of punctuation mark that I would like to look at is the N dash. It's another kind of dash, but it's way less common than the M dash. The N dash, it gets its name from the fact that it is about the length of a capital letter N, so it's slightly longer than a hyphen, and it's used primarily with dates and times, numbers in general. Now, on a PC, you can create an N dash by using the insert symbol or by typing Control plus minus on the number keypad. Word will also generate the N dash automatically if you put a hyphen between two numbers. However, I've seen instances where that doesn't work, so I'm not quite sure when it works and when it doesn't work. It probably has something to do with spacing. So if you use that technique to create an N dash, make sure that it looks like an N dash and not a hyphen. And if it does look like a hyphen, then use the alternative method of the insert symbol or the control plus minus sign on the number keypad to get a correct N dash. Again, now that we know how to create an N dash, let's look at when we would use an N dash. An N dash is used to connect words and numbers. For example, Richard Nixon, parentheses, 1913 to 1994, those two numbers are separated by an N dash. What that's indicating in this particular example is that Richard Nixon was born in 1913 and he died in 1994. Or the meeting is on Tuesday between 2 and 4:30 p.m. Here we have a time range, so we separate the time range with an N dash. Notice how we read these though. We say the meeting is on Thursday between 2 and 4 p.m. So the N dash in this case is basically substituting for the prepositions between 2 and 4. Also, another example, we caught the only direct Austin Santa Fe flight of the day. In this example, the N dash is used to separate the two cities, but when we were reading, we would probably say we caught the only direct flight between Austin and Santa Fe, or from Austin to Santa Fe. That's the way we would write it if we weren't using the N dash. And notice that the comment I have here, you do not want to mix the N dash with the words to and from. Very, very, very commonly, you'll see somebody writing, we caught the only direct flight from Houston Santa Fe. Don't do that. Say either direct Santa Fe Houston flight, Austin Santa Fe flight, or use the to and the from without the N dash. Another reason to use the N dash is to indicate that time is continuing. For example, John Anybody, 1983, N dash, has already published 2 novels. What that means is John Anybody was born in 1983 and he's still alive. So that N dash indicates that he does not, we do not yet have a year of death, just as we saw in the Richard Nixon example. And another unusual example, rarely used, but you might find it sometimes, is to use the N dash to connect 2 words that already are hyphenated. For example, Howard Dean presented himself as an odd pro-choice, pro-gun candidate. Pro-choice is hyphenated. Pro-gun is also hyphenated, but then we want to hyphenate those, both of those hyphenated hyphenated adjectives. We want to then join them together to create one gigantic hyphenated adjective before candidate. So we say pro-choice, N dash, pro-gun candidate. And that's, as I said, very rarely used, but that is another example of using the N dash that goes beyond the rule of using an N dash connect numbers and occasionally words. The next punctuation mark that I want to look at is the hyphen. The hyphen is like a kind of dash, but it's more commonly used than the M dash or the N dash, and we can tell it's special because it gets its own name. Hyphens look like dashes though, so do not confuse a hyphen with a dash, especially an N dash. The N dash is slightly longer than the hyphen. The hyphen is used to either connect words or to divide them between syllables. So, for example, we would use a hyphen to connect 2 or more words serving as a single adjective before a noun. This is probably the most common use of the hyphen. Example, a bare-chested warrior, an English-speaking city. In both of these examples, bare-chested is being used as a single compound adjective to describe warrior, or English speaking is being used as a compound adjective to describe the word city. In these cases, we use the hyphen. But if the adjective follows the noun, then we do not hyphenate. So, for example, the city is English speaking. It's no longer being used as a adjective preceding the noun, so there's no reason anymore to hyphenate it. The other reason we might use a hyphen is to form a compound noun of 2 nouns that show the same functions in one person or thing. For example, we might combine secretary and treasurer as with a hyphen because the person serving in that position is serving 2 roles, the role of secretary and the role of treasurer. So we create a title with a hyphen, secretary, treasurer. Or when we talk about, for example, in ancient Greece, we had the concept of city-states, so that's hyphenated. Or if we look at Star Trek, for example, the space-time continuum, there's a hyphenation there of two nouns that show a combination. Here we have a few other examples of when we would use the hyphen. We would use the hyphen between numbers from 21 to 99, and of course their derivatives. Note, however, that I disagree with your textbook on page 384 about using the hyphen with a range of numbers. I think that this is one of the functions of the N dash, which we've already discussed. You should also use the hyphen to indicate the spelling of a word. For example, my name is Jon, not John. To indicate that I am spelling out the word, I put a hyphen between each letter. And also, we would use a hyphen to prevent confusion in pronunciation when the addition of a prefix results in the doubling of a vowel. For example, we would write CO hyphen operation to indicate that the word is cooperation, or DE hyphen emphasize to indicate that the word is pronounced de-emphasize. Now, one of the things that's interesting to note here is the insertion of the hyphen is a relatively new phenomenon in American English. Some publications, like the New Yorker, prefer the older usage of the diaresis, or what we would call in German the umlaut. In other words, cooperation wouldn't be written with a hyphen, but rather we'd put a diaresis over the second O to indicate that both O's are pronounced cooperation, not cooperation, or de-emphasize instead of de-emphasize. But like I said, in modern English, at least in modern American English, the diaresis has largely been replaced by the hyphen, which I think is unfortunate. I think the diaresis is actually kind of cool, but maybe that's because of my German bias. But the diaresis is still used in English, but only where there's no clear demarcation. For example, in cooperation, it's clear that co is a prefix, and de-emphasize, it's clear that D is a prefix. But what about in the word naive? In the word naive, there is no prefix. The word naive comes from French, and there's no difference. There's no prefix. It's not NA prefix and then IVE. The whole word is one is naive. So the only way to really indicate that the both the A and the I are to be pronounced and we don't have a diphthong here is we put a diaresis over the I to indicate that there are two syllables here, naive. Or another example would be like, for example, in the name Zoe, we indicate with a diaresis over the E that this name is two syllables. It's not Zoe, it's Zoe. Z-O-E with a diaresis. Another example might be Noel. When we use that word, it's two syllables, so we put the diaresis over the E. Or in the authors, the Bronte sisters, it's not the Bront sisters. Normally in English, the final E would be silent, but we want to indicate that the final E is pronounced, so we would put a diaresis over the final E. I'm sure that sometimes using a word processor, you've written a word that starts with a prefix that begins with anti or mid or non or pro or un, and then you wrote the word without a hyphen, and Microsoft Word underlined it as an incorrect spelling. Hyphens are often used for words that are joined with those prefixes, anti, mid, non, pro, and un. But sometimes words have come into the English language where the hyphen has been dropped and they're now accepted as words without hyphens. For example, uncertain, antioxidant, midnight. So generally what's happening there is if you get a spelling error in Microsoft Word with one of these prefixes and under the red squiggly line, then what that basically is saying is you should insert a hyphen after the prefix, and then Microsoft Word spell checker will go away. So that's a good way to figure out whether or not the word has been added to a dictionary with the hyphen. If not, then you need to insert the hyphen. Another use of the hyphen is to form compound nouns and adjectives with the following prefixes: all, cross, double, X, great, heavy, ill, self, single, and well. When you have these prefixes and you're forming compound nouns or adjectives, you need to use the hyphen. When the handle is suspended, in other words, when the modifier is suspended, you need to handle that correctly when a sentence has more than a single hyphenated modifier. For example, Anne planned her vacation wardrobe for cold weather days, cool weather days, wet weather days. In each of these examples, the cold, cool, and wet are being joined with a hyphen to the noun weather. But we don't want to repeat cold weather, cool weather, wet weather. So we indicate that by putting a hyphen after the modifier, then followed by a comma, and then in the last one before the noun, we do not have a comma, we just have the hyphen and followed by the noun. So that's a way to handle multiple multiple hyphenated modifiers. Also note, in the old typewriter days, we used to come to an end of a line and we would use a hyphen to indicate that we were breaking a word up into two or more syllables, because there wasn't enough space on the page or on the line to continue typing the word. So we would break the word at an acceptable syllable break and using a hyphen, and then continue the word on the next line. With the age of computers, we don't have to do that anymore. It's not really necessary. We can use the line rep and proportional spacing to let the computer do the work for us, and if necessary, move the word to the next line or space out so that the word fits on the line. But sometimes we have extraordinarily long words that do have to be broken. So when we do that, then we have to go back to the old typewriter rule days, which means you need to consult a dictionary to find out where the correct syllable break is. You should never break a word with a hyphen in the middle of a syllable. The last punctuation mark that I would like to look at in this lecture is the slash, the lonely slash. The slash is used very, very rarely in English and has only a few specific usage. Most commonly, the slash is used between words in expressions that indicate choice. For example, just don't give a yes/no answer, or I wish we had more pass-fail classes, or a student should always pay attention to his or her grades. The slash indicates that there's a choice, so we separate those words with a slash. Another more specific usage of the slash is to indicate a line of poetry. When we are quoting poems of 1 to 3 lines, we generally use a slash to indicate the end of a verse and the beginning of the next verse. When we get more than 3 lines, we generally will not use a slash, but instead will indent the verse so that it indicates where the actual lines of verse are placed. So it's only used when we have only a few lines of poetry that we want to quote. So for example, from Shakespeare, only then does Lear understand that he has been a failure as a king. And then we have a quotation, "Oh, I have taken / too little care of this." Here we have a quotation that consists of 2 lines from the play, so we indicate the separation of the lines by the slash. And notice that there is a space before and after the slash, unlike above with the indications of choice where there is no space between the choices. And then one final modern usage of the slash is to indicate when we are using web addresses to indicate between the different nodes or dig down deeper into a web page, we use the slash.